about coping with death anxiety in times of crisis. I will say a few introductory words, after which we'll move right away to the presentations. Ironically, death is again in fashion. Not that it has ever left us, fortunately or unfortunately. Now, when I say death, what I have in mind is not, the death at the end of a long and fruitful life, and is not even the death, the accidental death that typically happens to somebody else. It's the death that can happen here, can happen today, can happen to me. And this type of death was made more salient by the surge in the international terrorism. Now, this type of increase in death salience is related to two different threats. One threat is... Oh, sure. Thanks. Okay, so this increase in death salience is related to two different threats. One threat is the threat to our implicit beliefs of what I'm going to call our implicit beliefs of immortality. The second threat is the threat to our sense of meaning. What about implicit beliefs of immortality? Of course, nobody or almost nobody believes that they are going to live forever on Earth. But everybody believes that they are going to live, for example, to be alive tomorrow. I want to mention the Israeli psychologist and stress expert Shlomo Brezhnitz in one of his books. He talks about a belief in immortality being founded or based on a belief in the principle of induction. We believe that the sun is going to rise tomorrow again. And we believe that the force of gravity, for example, doesn't just work from time to time. It always works, and everybody, or almost everybody who flew to Vancouver assumed that, entering those planes, that the plane is going to take off. And the plane obliged and took off. That's the principle of induction according to which the future resembles the past. Well, I have never died in the past, not in the past. And each time that I was sick, I was capable to recover. What's the conclusion? I'm not going to die in the future as well. So as you can see, an implicit belief in immortality is scientifically based on the principle of induction. But it's more difficult to believe in my immortality when I see people jumping from tall buildings. So in this sense, this increase in salience, mortality salience, is a threat to my implicit beliefs of immortality. Also, it's a threat to principles or to the sense of meaning. Again, when you see those pictures of people jumping from tall buildings, you understand that whatever meanings might mean, it doesn't mean this discontinuity that is related to this kind of event. So that is a threat. That salience is a threat to beliefs of immortality, and is a threat also to our sense of meaning. But it's more complicated than this. Those very beliefs in immortality and beliefs in meaning, on the other hand, allow us to transcend death, and specifically might allow the terrorist to transcend death. When you ask yourself what are the ingredients of a terrorist act, you have to say it is more than despair, it is more than hate. They probably include a very strong belief in immortality and a very strong sense of meaning. And I'm going to finish with a quotation from Ernest Becker, From Escape from Evil, his book published posthumously in 1975. And quoting from Becker, man aggresses not only out of frustration and fear, but out of joy, plenitude, love of life. And men kill lavishly out of the sublime joy of heroic triumph over evil. Our symposium will be focused on how to deal or how to cope with the increased salience of mortality, and perhaps also will touch on the motivation of the terrorist as well. So without further ado, we'll move to the first presentation, Tom Pyszczynski from University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, who will talk about the TMT, the terror management theory, and some of the applications of terror management theory. Thanks.
I'm going to need help. Hello? Oh, yeah. This will just take a minute, I hope. Okay. Trusty glass of water. Just to set the stage, I want to just put up an overhead that is the several quotes from Osama bin Laden, his famous fatwa declaring war against the United States and the Western world in general. And I just want to do this to set the tone for our talk today a little bit. For the last 15 years or so, my colleagues and I, and my colleagues and I mean Jeff Greenberg from the University of Arizona and Sheldon Solomon from Skidmore College, have been working on a theory that attempts to integrate ideas from existential philosophy and psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, cultural anthropology, sociology, and evolutionary theory with contemporary thinking within experimental social psychology, which is our own field. We were very heavily influenced by reading a series of books by Ernest Becker. I hope you've all read these books as well. The Birth and Death of Meaning, Denial of Death, Escape from Evil, were the ones that we found most inspiring. Of course, he's written some other very wonderful things. When we finished graduate school in social psychology in the early 1980s, we finished with a general sense that something was missing from the discourse within our field, that something was missing theoretically from the ideas that experimentally, empirically oriented social psychologists worked with. And we thought we found some of these things in the work of Ernest Becker. So we developed a theory over the years that we called terror management theory about the role that the human awareness of death plays in everyday life. And over the 15 or so years since then, an experimental existential psychology has gradually emerged within mainstream academic psychology. The very first time I used the term experimental existential psychology in a talk, an older professor in the back of the room just started giggling. And I asked him what was so funny. He says, that's oxymoronic. He says, experimental psychology, existential psychology, where have you been? These are opposites. And that was very true. Experimental psychologists had little use for existential ideas, largely because I think they were viewed as untestable. I think that existential psychologists tended to view the ideas that experimental psychologists were working with as incredibly simple-minded, missing the richness of human experience. I would argue that the methods that are used in experimental psychology have advanced tremendously over the last 20 or 30 years, so that nowadays many ideas can be put to very rigorous tests, ideas that in the past were seen as beyond the boundaries of ordinary scientific inquiry. Now, over the years, we used to get a chuckle when we were working with these ideas called terror management theory, and about once a year we would get a reprint request from the University of Baghdad or the University of Tehran asking us, what do you know about managing terrorism? And we would have to write back saying, well, I think this is going to be disappointing, this isn't what you think. One time we were invited to give a talk at a conference in Portugal, and I don't know, some of you I think probably know Sheldon Solomon. He was our speaker. Sheldon showed up dressed as he usually does, and he was sitting at a table going over his notes in an empty room, and before he knew it, the room was filled with generals and colonels in full military attire prepared to talk about terrorism. And Sheldon was sitting in his mismatched tie-dyes, feeling really out of place. All right? So the point I want to make is that terror management theory is not a theory about terrorism. It is a theory about the role that the human awareness of death plays in everyday life. The way it affects us in ways that seem very, very removed and distant from the problem. Terror management theory attempts to draw the links between the motives that we're aware of, our desire to prove our value, to convince people that our beliefs are correct, and so on, how these things are influenced by our underlying fear of death. Now, at first, this was a pretty controversial approach within experimental social psychology. It met some resistance, but over the years, lots and lots of experimental evidence has piled up. To date, there are over 150 separate studies conducted in 9 different countries, a recent one being done on Aboriginal people in the Australian outback, that have all converged on some very consistent findings that lend support for our theory. The theory has been applied to a very wide range of behavior, and it's gradually been gaining an acceptance. So we were going along our ways, doing research, going to conferences, talking, and so on. And then on September 11th last year, a group of terrorists crashed a pair of planes into the World Trade Center in New York City. Shortly thereafter, another group of terrorists related to the first crashed another plane into the Pentagon, and a fourth plane that was presumably headed towards the White House was crashed in rural Pennsylvania as a result of an uprising of passengers who had found out what was going on, decided they would take matters into their own hand and do battle with the terrorists. At this point, I think our world changed. Things became very different for all of us. We, like everyone else, were shocked, dismayed, horrified, frightened. Sheldon was in the World Trade Center at 9 in the morning the day before of the bombing, and he was teaching at Brooklyn College, and could, at the time the thing happened, and could see the smoke plumes outside of his windows. I'd like to invite you all to just think back to what you were doing and thinking on September 11th of last year. And just sort of bring that with you as we talk about these issues today. As the dust settled, we began to realize that there were some really amazing parallels between what people seemed to be doing to cope with this terrorist attacks and what we had seen in dozens and dozens of laboratory studies in which we exposed people to reminders of their own death and faced them with a challenge to their cultural beliefs or values. Today what I'd like to do is look at what terror management theory has to tell us about the way people have been coping with terrorism. Now, we recently finished a book called In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, that also goes into some ideas about the roots of terrorism, some of the forces that might be motivating the terrorists to take actions of this sort, to sacrifice their own lives in the pursuit of this cause that they're pursuing. I don't think I'm going to have time to get into that today, but maybe we'll just touch on some of those issues a little bit. So, to start with, we developed terror management theory with three basic purposes in mind. First of all, psychologists of virtually all stripes tend to agree that people are driven to maintain a positive view of themselves, that we need self-esteem. That self-esteem is associated with all manners of healthy adaptive functioning. And this need for self-esteem is used in many, many theories of behavior as a mechanism for explaining why people do things. So we help other people to feel good about ourselves. We get aggressive towards other people when our image of ourselves is damaged. Virtually every form of human behavior you can imagine has at some point been linked to the need for self-esteem and seen as a way of getting self-esteem, yet, as far as we could tell, empirically oriented scientists were not even considering the question of why people need self-esteem. We thought Becker's ideas provided some very compelling answers to that question. Secondly, why do people need to be right about everything? In spite of the fact that we all realize that there are hundreds and thousands of different possible perspectives to take on the world, possible value systems, we tend to believe that our set of beliefs and values are the correct one. And we tend to work very hard to maintain that belief and get very angry and hostile towards people who challenge that belief. And then finally, the basic question that social psychologists have always been interested in, why do people have such a hard time getting along with others, especially those who are different from themselves? Okay? So we hoped that we could use some of Ernest Becker's ideas, integrate them with contemporary thinking in experimental social psychology to come up with some answers to this question, to develop a theoretical framework that could be used to think about and address these questions. And very importantly, from our perspective, we wanted to develop a framework that was amenable to rigorous empirical testing. So here's the basic idea, or set of ideas. We start with a consideration of how humans are both similar to and different from other species. And the basic idea is that, like all other living things, humans are born with an instinct for self-preservation, a strong desire to stay alive. We think this is rooted in basic evolutionary processes. We think this self-preservation instinct, for lack of better label, is something that evolved very early in the history of life, long before there were Homo sapiens or mammals or complex life forms. Organisms that were oriented towards staying alive and avoiding things that would undermine their existence tended to live longer, long enough to reproduce and pass those genes on and so forth. So the idea that people want to live, we're sort of taking as our jumping off point, something we share with all other animals. Our species, however, evolved a variety of other adaptations that gave us flexibility and the potential for freedom. Basically a set of complex intellectual capacities. Specifically, we like to think in terms of the capacity for symbolic thought, make one thing stand for another, which is the basis for language. The capacity to think in terms of cause and effect, to ask why things are the way they are. The capacity to project ourselves in the future and imagine things that have yet to happen, generating expectations for the future. And the capacity for self-awareness or self-reflective thinking. We can reflect back on ourselves and recognize ourselves as a separate, unique aspect of existence that's different from anything else. Capacity for self-consciousness. Now, if you look at contemporary theories of motivation, although there's lots of them, you'll see that these 4 basic capacities are central to a wide range of theories of how people motivate themselves and regulate their behavior towards achieving the goals that are of importance to them. We suggest that these sophisticated intellectual abilities had an unfortunate byproduct, and that was that they made us aware that we were going to die. They made us aware that death is inevitable, inescapable, that it can come any time for any number of reasons, none of which are too pleasant. We can conceive of cancer and AIDS and heart attacks. We can conceive of automobile crashes, murders. I always use this example in the past because I thought it was cute, but we could conceive of airplanes crashing through the ceilings of our building and taking us all out in a ball of fire. And now we can conceive of that even better than we ever could before. All right? Basic idea is that awareness of the inevitability of death in an animal that's instinctively driven to stay alive creates the potential for paralyzing terror, immense fear that would threaten our potential for survival. In other words, our intelligence, which made us aware of death, our intelligence, which has so many advantages for us, made us aware of death, and the potential for terror that created could actually get in the way of us staying alive. It could turn intelligence into an evolutionary dead end, ultimately, that ultimately was maladaptive. Unless our species did something to deal with the problem, terror management theory suggests that humankind dealt with the problem of death by using the same sophisticated intellectual abilities that gave rise to the problem of terror by creating cultures. By culture, we mean shared systems of beliefs, shared explanations for how the world works. So the idea is that as we're evolving these intellectual capacities, we began trying to explain how things work, because that helps us act effectively in the world. But the potential for terror put a press on the belief systems that were emerging, such that any belief system that was going to be successful, that was going to be adopted by large numbers of people, had to provide means of managing the potential for terror. And this press that the potential for terror puts on cultures, we think, also happens on, this press that the potential for terror puts on emerging cultural belief systems in sort of a historical, archaeological sense, also operates on an individual developmental level. This potential for terror also presents a press on the emerging belief systems that we as individuals adopt, such that in order to be effective, to be acceptable to us, our understandings of reality have to help us control the potential for fear that exists in our ultimate awareness of death. A theory suggests that there are two basic mechanisms that emerged out of all this. First of all, a cultural worldview, which is our conception of reality, our theory of how the world works, which provides meaning, order, and permanence to existence. A set of standards that make it possible for we as individuals to have value, to give us self-esteem, a set of standards for what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong, what's beautiful and what's ugly. And if we live up to these standards, we feel good about ourselves. And finally, the promise of either literal or symbolic immortality to those who believe in a cultural worldview and live up to the standards of value that are part of it. Now, by literal immortality, we're talking about beliefs about the world, belief systems that promise us that we will literally continue to live after the point of physical death. Concepts like heaven, reincarnation, nirvana, all cultures have concepts of this sort that give us some hope of continuing on after the point of our physical demise. In addition, cultures also provide the potential for symbolic immortality, which is a sense that we're part of something bigger, more powerful, longer lasting, more eternal than our individual existence. So that by being Americans or Canadians or scientists or psychologists, or even the best thing, of course, is to be an existential psychologist. And if you can really manage it, an experimental existential psychologist is really where you want to be. That's going to get you going. You're going to live on forever. You also attain symbolic immortality through your children, through your works, through the things you leave behind. So the idea is that our cultural belief systems give us these two major mechanisms for dealing with death: literal immortality and symbolic immortality. And the qualifications for either type, the requirements for either type, is that we believe in a cultural conception of reality, view that as absolutely correct, and believe that we're making a valuable contribution, that we're living up to the roles and values that are part of that conception of reality, which gives us self-esteem. One more piece of the theory, because both of these things, all of this stuff, all of these protective mechanisms and shields are abstract linguistic constructions, things that humans create themselves that don't have a tangible physical existence. We rely on other people to help us maintain faith in our beliefs and values and our belief in our own value. So the idea is that both of these components of the cultural anxiety buffer are maintained through a process of social consensus. When other people see things the way I do, it increases my faith that my conception is correct. When other people see the world differently, it challenges my faith in the correctness of my concept of the world or myself, and therefore reduces the effectiveness of these structures as buffers against core anxiety. So those are the basic ideas of the theory. Now, I told you that what we've done is embarked on a program of research to assess various aspects of the theory. What I'm going to do today is, rather than summarize individual studies, I've sort of abstracted 7 basic lines of evidence, 7 basic points that these studies have made. As I said, to date, there are over 150 individual experiments done all over the world, mostly in the United States and Israel and the Netherlands and Canada, but there have been some studies done in Japan recently. I mentioned some done in Australia with Aborigines. First of all, given the theory, these are some hypotheses that we deduced from the theory, and then we went out and did experiments to assess the hypothesis. Now, I want to emphasize that what's particularly important here is the way these 7 lines of evidence converge and come together in supporting the core propositions of the theory. So I want you to think about that as we go through this. First of all, increasing self-esteem or faith in one's worldview leads to less anxiety in response to reminders of death. We bring people into a laboratory, boost their self-esteem, give them a validation of their belief system, and then we measure anxiety either with self-report scales, with physiological arousal, or we bring up the problem of death and look at how defensive they get in some other way, and we find consistently that increasing self-esteem and increasing faith in the worldview reduce anxiety in a wide range of manifestations in response to thoughts of death. Secondly, this is the most commonly researched hypothesis. We call it the mortality salience hypothesis. The point here is that reminding people of their mortality, the fact that they're going to die, leads them to work harder to maintain and defend their cultural worldviews and work harder to maintain and defend self-esteem. So, for example, when people are reminded of death, we find that they become more accepting of people who praise their culture and more hostile towards people who criticize it. After reminding people of death, we find that people become more accepting of people who just implicitly validate their beliefs by being part of the same culture and more hostile towards people who come from different cultures. They also work harder to attain self-esteem in a wide variety of ways. The third point is an important one that illustrates, I think, the utility of this experimental approach, because this point came out of some inconsistencies in our laboratory evidence. And I won't go into the details. It's kind of a long and I think interesting story, but the basic point here is that thoughts of death lead to increased worldview defense and self-esteem striving when they're on the fringes of consciousness. Not when we're consciously thinking about them, not when they're long gone and far removed from consciousness, but when they're on the edges of consciousness. How we got to this, basically, was that in the early days of the research, the findings were not entirely consistent, and we would occasionally encounter people who couldn't replicate our findings. And when we looked at what everyone was doing, we found out that this stuff happens about 5 minutes after you bring up the problem of death, or if you distract people from the problem of death. While people are thinking about death, they do something very different. And, in retrospect, this makes perfect sense, but while you're thinking about death, what you're going to do is you're going to say, I'm not going to die for a long time. My grandmother lived to be 97, so I can expect to live at least into my 90s. And besides that, I recently quit smoking, so that ought to increase my life expectancy further. And I'm going to lose this weight, and I'm going to get more exercise, and I'm going to do all those things that my doctor tells me will help me live forever. Okay, so when we're thinking about death, we do things that are logically and rationally connected to the problem of death. Or we just block the problem out, and we suppress the thought, remove the thoughts from consciousness. When thoughts of death are on the fringes of consciousness, now in cognitive language we would say, when thoughts of death are highly accessible, they come to mind easily and quickly, but they're not in focal attention, that's when we work to embed ourselves in the cultural worldview and prove our value as members of the culture. That's when we do the terror management things. That's when we strive for meaning and value. Now, this helps explain why for some people this theory may not make sense at first. And we've encountered a lot of that. A lot of people say, I don't think about death very much, and when I do think about death, I don't think about how great it is to be an American or how great it is to be a psychologist or any of that. I think about going to get a physical, or I think about going to get some exercise. Well, that's exactly right. thoughts of death, when they're conscious, lead to things that are rationally related to the problem, rational problem solving, but when they're unconscious, on the edge of awareness, they lead to this attempt to embed ourselves in the cultural belief system. Other research shows that increasing self-esteem or faith in one's worldview eliminates the effect of death reminders on worldview defense or self-esteem striving. Some very recent studies show that increasing people's confidence in the existence of life after death eliminates the effects of death reminders on self-esteem striving and worldview defense. We recently did a series of studies that were presented at a poster here, I hope, yesterday, that show that if you can convince people, even atheists, if you can convince them that some part of us continues after death, which we did by having them read summaries of research on the near-death experience that were sort of doctored up a little to make it even more convincing than it sounds to many people, and this isn't the place to debate any of that. I don't know what it means, but we presented people with summaries of research that was very favorable to the idea that the near-death experience implies that consciousness continues after death. And after doing that, reminders of death no longer led to the defensive reactions that we'd seen in many, many studies, okay? So if you can, said differently, if you can give people literal immortality, they'll take that, and that reduces their need for symbolic immortality. Okay, threats to one's worldview or self-esteem and reminders of one's creaturely animal nature increase the accessibility of death-related thoughts. So if I were to challenge your cultural beliefs, challenge your value, or remind you of your animal nature, of the similarities between you and other creatures, that would make death-related thoughts come closer to consciousness. And we assess that using some fairly widely accepted cognitive methods that actually build on projective tests, where we would give people a series of word stem completions. For example, we would give them the word C-O-F-F blank blank. What do you see? Coffee or coffin, it's your choice, right? But what we do is we give them a bunch of these with maybe 30 of these completions with 6 death-related possibilities and count up the number of death-related completions. When the worldview is threatened, when self-esteem is threatened, when central relationships are threatened, or, and this is a whole other story, or when you remind people of their animal nature, death-related completions go through the ceiling. They go way up. Now, the animal nature stuff is important because it links to some recent work we've done linking these ideas to the problem of sexuality, but that's another story that if you're interested in I can direct you to later. Finally, defending one's worldview, increasing self-esteem, or viewing oneself as more than an animal reduces the accessibility of death thoughts after they've recently been primed. Okay, so we would argue that this body of evidence, these, yes?
When you talk about reducing death thoughts, are you talking about fears of death? Or?
No, it reduces the accessibility of death-related thoughts. Now, the most common way of measuring that is with those word stem completions. So, for example, out of 30, okay, we'd give them 30 word stems. 6 can be completed in a death-related way. Normally, priming people with death leads to an increased accessibility, but if they defend their worldview or reassert their self-esteem, the accessibility of thoughts outside of awareness drops down.
I guess I'm trying to get to whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, whether they have these death.
Well, we tend to think that it's not optimal because death-related thoughts drive a lot of defensive behavior. Okay? So, how am I doing on time? Oh, 1 more minute. Okay. Okay. What does this have to do with terrorism, you may ask? Well, 3 more minutes? Perfect. 3 minutes I can do. Well, to find that out, you're going to have to buy In the Wake of 9/11, which you can now, no. Looking at how Americans have reacted to terrorism, first of all, we think of the terrorist attacks as doing 2 basic things from this perspective. First of all, they forced us to face very dramatically our mortality. Seeing the scenes of the buildings imploding, of people jumping from the buildings, reading about the death count, seeing the faces of survivors over and over reminds us of the fact that we're going to die and how death can come so unexpectedly, so suddenly, out of the blue. Nobody going to work at the World Trade Center that day had any inkling what was going to happen, right? Life is that way. I mean, any of us could have an aneurysm pop while we're going through the talk. This is a very graphic reminder of this. And at the same time, what the terrorists did is they attacked major symbols of American power. The World Trade Center and the Pentagon. They did it on American soil with American airlines, just showing basically that America cannot protect us. That the sense of safety and invulnerability that we have living in the United States and Canada, I imagine as well, is really very illusory. It's showing us that this could happen almost any time, anywhere. And I just want to mention a couple of things, some of the obvious parallels. First of all, one of the things you saw people doing after the attacks was an incredible search for meaning, a search for understanding of what happened. I spent days channel surfing on the television, from one news channel to another, trying to get the latest, trying to find out what was going on. Many studies show that when people are reminded of death, they work especially hard to impose meaning on ambiguous stimuli, and they'll even see meaning in random strings of information more rapidly than they would if they're not reminded of death. Another very obvious thing you saw after the attacks was an amazing surge in patriotism. Flags cropped up on every corner of the United States. I'm not sure exactly what happened in Canada, but in the United States, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing flags on T-shirts and windows and cars. There's a flag underwear for sale, you name it. Many studies have shown that reminders of death increase patriotism and increase respect and admiration for the American flag, for example. Reminders of death have been shown to lead to a suppression of dissent, increased hostility towards those who view the world differently. And in the days after the attacks, when an American commentator would even raise the possibility that the Arabs, the terrorists, might have had some reason to be angry at us, they would get death threats. They would be threatened to be fired. Bill Maher, who, I don't know if you know who he is over here, but he does this television show, Politically Incorrect, and he just made this offhand comment. He's supposed to make funny comments about the news, and he said something like, I don't know where people get off calling the terrorists cowards. It takes guts to ram an airplane into a building when you're sitting in the front seat. And, he's trying to be funny, but he's basically off the air now. He lost his job already after many people objected to that comment. An increase in bigotry and prejudice of all kinds. I want to put up one other thing, just because it kind of shows some similarities between fundamentalists, that's not it, of all stripes. This was Jerry Falwell's explanation for what happened. I'm sure most of you have seen this already. Other research shows that reminders of death lead to increased striving to live up to the standards of value that are part of your worldview. And some of our studies show that when tolerance is emphasized, which is something that was done shortly after the attack. Even President Bush gave, in one of, I think, probably the best speech of his career, called on the nation to hold back from taking out their anger and frustration on people, on Americans from the Middle East, on visitors from the Middle East, and to show some understanding. You would see the rather unusual sight of interfaith gatherings of clerics from the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, and Islam getting together to talk about the attacks with the members of their communities. Another sign of striving to live up to the worldview standards would be increases in attempts to help, incredible outpouring of charity donations, blood donations, and so on. And finally, a great increase in the need for heroes, which is something we've also found in many studies. To summarize, I just suggest that what terror management theory suggests is that in helping people deal with the problem of death, what you want to do is give them the things that give them protection against the basic existential problem that we all face daily, the problem of death. You want to give them meaning, you want to give them a sense of personal value, opportunities to feel good about themselves, and you want to give them close interpersonal relationships. Okay, I'm sorry I don't have more time, but I think I really do need to stop.
The thing is, what you said about some of the activity that we have engaged ourselves in has done that in such a very negative fashion.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could deal with the positive approaches to that versus the negative, like, you know, raising the flag is really nice, but, you know, picture it.
Yeah, well, all I would say is that when you have a very complex, multifaceted threat that's affecting billions of people, different people will respond to it in different ways, and that there's individual psychological proclivities, the values that are activated. All these things are going to drive the individual's attempts to cope. Now, like all things, you know, one of the things we've sort of concluded based on the research we've been doing is that thoughts of death don't lead people to be better or worse people. It just drives them to work harder to live up to the standards that are important to them at the time. That can lead to good and it can lead to evil.
I think in the interest of time, what we are going to do is pose only questions for the end of the presentation.